The next speaker is Elihu ריכטר. Elihu is a doctor, medicine. He's professor in the Hebrew University of Jerusalem in Hadassah Hospital. What Elihu is doing, very interesting and very innovative regard of the genocide. He used his speciality and tried to implement it to the issue of genocide. And he has wonderful insights that we all can benefit from.
I'm a doctor in public health. And in public health, we make house calls. Historians don't make house calls. I make house calls on history, which means looking at what has happened in terms of moral choices. Now, I became very, very interested in the work of Dadrian about the strange role of Turkish physicians as architects, planners, and perpetrators of the Armenian genocide. And as a doctor, I have to ask the question, how did doctors, of all people, become involved in such an enterprise? And when I ask this question about the Armenian genocide, we go fast forward to what subsequently happened in the Holocaust and thereafter, even down to modern times. And I hope we'll have a minute or two to talk about modern times as part of my talk. Now, we've heard, of course, Hitler's famous statement, who, after all, speaks today of the annihilation of the Armenians? And I recall that as he made this statement, at about that time, as World War II broke, after he attacked Poland, he began gassing, not Jews, but fellow Germans in mental institutions. That's how it all began in Germany. And how the timeline of gassing Germans first, and then Jews, and other target groups, itself tells us a great deal about the strange motivations of doctors in genocide. The sad truth is that I must tell you, as someone in public health, is that doctors have been pioneers in the promotion of genocide. That sounds like an oxymoron. How can it be? The role of doctors in both the Armenian genocide and in the Holocaust as leaders in carrying out mass murder. How can that be? Here, by the way, is a very, very crude timeline of the Armenian genocide, which I must admit is a bit obsolete and we're now revising. And what it shows is that even before the mass murder begins, there are all kinds of warning signs, something which everybody in genocide studies and history knows. And the fact that there are warning signs, by the way, is what led me as an epidemiologist into the whole story of working on genocide. Because in epidemiology, we say if something is predictable, it is preventable. And that's why I'm here today. Now, the timeline of the Armenian genocide is here. We don't have the time to go through this mighty timeline. Herut already presented it, and I'm very glad you mentioned the whole story of what happened with Sultan Abdul Hamid II. You've just saved me 2 minutes of my talk. Pardon?
Thank you.
Yeah, and I think the story of Sultan Abdul Hamid II is somewhat neglected today in modern discussions of the Armenian genocide, because after all, he, under his aegis, the Ottomans murdered 300,000 people by some estimates, 200,000 by others, but some horrific number. And what's also important is that he, in some ways, was the pioneer, or under his regime, was the pioneer of much of the rhetoric of incitement that Hitler later copied and incorporated. So we see strange antecedents, not only for the Holocaust, but for the measurements to prepare populations to carry out mass murder. This is something which I find terribly important as someone interested in prediction and prevention. Because if such incitement led to such mass murder in scenario after scenario, then perhaps what we should be doing to stop genocide is to stop the incitement to genocide, especially by regimes in power. That's today what I do. Now, Turkish doctors as perpetrators, planners and organizers, they were big, big players. And the reasons for their doing so were interesting. A lot of eugenics at that time was in the air, which merged in Turkey with notions of racial purity, ethnic purity, xenophobia. It was a strange mix of junk science and junk politics and junk ethics in the air, and not unique to Turkey and to Germany. Eugenics was a Northern European and North American phenomenon. And as you may know, in the United States, in the name of eugenics, compulsory sterilization and restrictive immigration were imposed in the 1920s. So there was nothing unique here. Again, the whole medical motif, the whole medical rationale for such horrible measures. Now, some of the doctors were not just implementers. They had an executive committee of 5 or 6 people. The executive committee played a very, very key role in designing the plans to carry out the Armenian genocide. And some of these people were very key people in Turkish medicine. They were not marginal people, and some went on to continue to be quite active in Turkish medicine after the Armenian genocide. Now the most horrible event was the story of Turkish doctors gassing children. Now, what happened is I believe it was about 1916 or 17. Turkish doctors improvised low-tech gas chambers. They were not industrial gas chambers of the kind that the Germans designed in the concentration camps in World War II. What the Turkish doctors simply did was to put children into basements, enclosed basements, and pump gas into these basements, toxic agents, and the children died. And there was horrible screaming, horrible shouts, and all the rest. It was a horrible thing, and this was part of the plan. Now, Turkish doctors also, they agonized a bit about this, about what they were doing. Now, here's where we get into the heart of the matter. How could they do what they were doing if they were doctors? Well, to their point of view, in the light of eugenics at the time and all the strange ideas of racial supremacy and so on, they were carrying out this mass murder as part of their mission in public health. They did not see what they were doing as in opposition to public health, but as a direct part of that mission. They were promoting public health by getting rid of populations who were a threat to the body politic and to the public health of the majority of the population they identified with. This is something we find so crazy and so sick, but that notion was the norm of the time. And that's the problem. That norm is the issue which we doctors today have to wrestle. Now, in 1918, the Turkish government was forced to put on trial the perpetrators, the medical perpetrators of some of the massacres, of the gassing. But it was a show trial. The effect was not very, very lasting. And there were punishments, but the precedent was established. So, again, murdering people for the sake of public health. Now, there's an idea here behind these actions. How are we in time, by the way? Plenty. What you have here is a concept which hardened into Nazi medicine. You get rid of, first of all, our job is to get rid of sickness. Well, to get rid of sickness, you then morph into something a little odd. To get rid of sickness, let's get rid of sick individuals. And then you think epidemiologically. Instead of getting rid of sick individuals, let's get rid of groups of individuals or sick populations. And so there you see the rapid slide down the slippery slope when you see the idea of protecting populations en masse by getting rid of populations, other populations, who are seen as a threat to the health of the population you are protecting. Grotesque, but that was the norm of the time. And not that far removed from the eugenics in Northern Europe, the compulsory sterilization, the restrictive immigration, and other expressions of rejection of the other in the most extreme, proactive kinds of ways. Now, I didn't bring my computer glasses. Now, there were the Trabzon trials in 1919, which laid out all the evidence implicating the doctors who carried out the gassing. And in a sense, these trials were forerunners of the Nuremberg trials after World War II. Now, as you made so clearly, Harut, the antecedents, the role of the German military as observers, enablers, bystanders, participants, and technical enablers, would you say? In helping the Turks perpetrate the Armenian genocide is now receiving ever more documentation, especially from archives from Germany. And one of our speakers today is going to be talking about the role of the Armenian genocide in the imagination of German intellectuals during the 1920s. Now, in parallel with that that link between Turkish perpetrators and German enablers or observers was the parallel with what later became Nazi medicine, starting with German medicine in the 1920s. As you've noted, the aftershocks of the Armenian genocide continued well into the 1920s. I should say Armenian, Assyrian, and Greek genocides. And at about that time, in the 1920s, German psychiatrists were beginning to talk about, what about the getting rid of mental defectives? Maybe that's a radical solution. It was that goal was stated in very, very careful terms, but that's what was proposed. And a colleague of mine, Jutta Linderert, has published a very fine article on the timeline of the role of Nazi psychiatry in taking Nazi medicine further down the slippery slope. And, of course, we all know that the preoccupation with eugenics and racial hygiene was not something peripheral. It was mainstream to German medicine. It was a doctrine espoused by the top people in German medical science. Now, even so, there always were people who said no. And there seems to be a rough generalization for most studies of genocide scenarios is that 1 out of every 10 people says, I'm not going to go in for this stuff. And to me, one of the questions we have to ask is what makes those 1 out of 10 heroes? Because if whatever it is that makes them into what they did, we should be studying them very, very carefully because they are role models for what we call positive deviance. So far, we've talked about collective negative deviance at the social and institutional and professional, public and political level. We have to start looking for those who make the right choices. Now, Now, here's a little bit of word about a slide about the technology of gassing children. Again, Hitler's comment, and now Nazi medicine. Again, the role models were the story of the Armenian genocide. We get rid of those who are not fit, and then you go into German psychiatry. Now, what interests me about this whole 2 minutes? 4. Oh, fine. We're in good shape. I've told you I'm interested in prediction and prevention. Can we in the medical profession, who did so much to promote mass murder, genocide, and rape, and all the other horrible evils of our time, become part of the solution rather than part of the problem? I, as an epidemiologist, submit or wish to share with you the tools of prediction and prevention, which can be used to intervene before the mass murder starts. For me, the big early warning sign is dehumanizing hate language and threats. By dehumanization, I mean the language of pigs, microbes, cancers, and so on and so forth. Basically, the language of Mein Kampf, which it turns out echoed terminology used in the time of Sultan Abdul Hamid II. And I think Sultan Abdul Hamid II deserves much more publicity for his role in husbanding and circulation and propagation of much of this hate language back in the 1890s. Now, this is from Israel Charney's textbook. Here's Purity in Nazi Medicine, the Slippery Slope. This is the Dean of the University of Jena, Dr. Edmund Pernkopf, or University of Vienna, being saluted by his medical students. Here's eugenics. And here is the justification that Nazi medicine gave for extermination. It's very cost effective. All those people sitting around in medical institutions add to the medical bill. And this became a very powerful argument as Nazi war expenses increased and World War II broke out. And here again, the followers of Pernkopf. And then, oh, plenty of time. And here is my favorite hero of this ugly story. A man named Dr. Karl Astel, Dean of the University of Jena. Nazi medicine was a pioneer in cancer prevention and in smoking cessation. Now, how can it be? How can it be that people who were gassing people in the morning were running smoking cessation clinics in the evening? It's very, very simple. Both tasks, both missions, were part of the same agenda, protecting the health of the master race by, one, making the master race healthier with smoking cessation, exercise, nutrition, summer camps, and so on and so forth, and at the same time, getting rid of the populations who were perceived as a threat to the health of this population, the microbes, the lice, the cancer, and so on and so forth. So Dr. Karl Astel ran smoking cessation clinics and ran gas extermination chambers at the same time. He saw these activities as two sides of the same coin. There was no contradiction. And it takes some thinking to observe, to understand all this. Now, fast forward. We're here with today, here and now, with the story of another doctor, an ophthalmologist, not too far away, about 200 miles away, Dr. Bashir Assad. Here's the timeline of his death toll. Not updated, it's now much higher, to 250 to 300,000. And he too gives a tortuous justification in medical terms of what he's doing, the killing to protect the safety of his population. And so we see here these ideas running into modern times. Finished. Okay, now, so the unanswered questions. Why are there ethical choices for the Turkish doctors? Are there ethical choices for us today? Of course there are. And if there's anything I say, it is that I do not believe in historical determinism. I believe that there are human choices all along the way. Yes, there are mighty forces out there, but we know in genocide studies that the outcome is a function of human choice and bystander indifference. And if we're talking about human choice, then I, as a doctor, have to ask, what choices should we be making to prevent a recurrence of these horrible evils today? Now, here we are. Again, Hitler's reminding us, and again, I say perhaps the antidote, or not perhaps, definitely the antidote to the horrible evils of the time is underscoring the sanctity of life as a core value, not negotiable, to be a unshakable barrier to the activities of all those professional activities which were a consequence of sliding down the slippery slope. Thank you very much.
As I promised you, I think that we heard many of very provoking insight, and I must say I've learned a lot from this speak of you, and thank you very much.